Okay, so we're headed into the section of Genesis that we've looked at Isaac, we've looked at Abraham, certainly looked at all the events leading up to God taking Abraham out of the land of Ur. And so now we're going to put some focus on Jacob. So we'll be roughly beginning in Genesis chapter 25 as we kind of go through the life of Jacob and making connections to Jesus. That's kind of the goal. So as we've done other times in this class, since we're covering a large amount of material, let's just very quickly describe Jacob. What do you know about Jacob's life, or how would you describe Jacob if you were talking about him to somebody? Various elements of his life. Anything counts.
He had a brother.
He had a brother. Yes, he had a brother. What was his brother's name?
Esau.
Esau. Yes, he had a brother named Esau. Anything else?
Family conflict.
Family conflict. Yeah, lots of family conflict there. In his childhood, family conflict, and then family conflict in adulthood. I'm not sure which one you were referring to. You were just, it's a blanket statement. It counts at both. Yeah. He was a trickster, so there's a lot of deception involved in the way that he lived and interacted with people. Anything else?
He wrestled with an angel.
He wrestled with an angel. Yeah, we'll talk about that one in particular. That's an odd event in his life that stands out. Anything else? Okay, so as we look at Jacob, and you continue this family lineage from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, Isaac is the son of promise. He is the son of old age. Isaac then ends up getting married, and he and Rebekah, they end up having two sons, Jacob and Esau. The oldest of those is Esau. The youngest of those is Jacob. A very short time span difference between the two of them. But this is another one of those examples that shows up very early on of God showing all along that it is about his plan and not about any particular plans of men. When you go to Genesis 25, and Rebekah is pregnant, and the children are struggling within her in verse 22. And she says, if it is so, why then am I this way? And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord's answer to her is, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now, this is an important text because later on in Romans 9, we're going to get some clarification on some lessons from this. So Jacob and Esau, they're both in the womb, and God, before either of them is born, decides that the older one will serve the younger one. Esau will serve Jacob. In Romans chapter 9, we get some clarification that this is a lesson for us. Not only this, but there was Rebekah also, which she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, and had not done anything good or bad, this, by the way, is a great verse to go to show people that sin is a choice, right? Because they are in the womb still, and there's no sin. They've done neither good nor bad. So that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger. So God decides in the very beginning, not based off of anything good or bad about Jacob or Esau, just simply because this is his plan, that the lineage of Christ would come through Jacob and not Esau. That is a surprising thing on a couple of different levels. One reason is just simply that Esau's the older, right? As Esau is the older, the birthright would naturally be with him, and it would be natural to trace lineage through the eldest. And so God is saying, no, I'm not going to do that. That shouldn't surprise us too much, because with Abraham, the same sort of thing happened, right? Ishmael was the eldest. Isaac yet became the son of promise. Another aspect to it, though, is that it is not in any way based off of merit. It wasn't because God looked at Jacob and said, this is a better guy than Esau. As was mentioned, as you were all kind of describing Jacob, Jacob is not the paragon of virtue in his life. Right? He's known as a trickster, a deceiver. He has family conflict, a lot of that due to the deception and things like that, his whole life. As you go through and look at his life, there are a lot of character flaws, as well as a large chunks of time that seem to show very minimal devotion to God. There are times where he will reinvigorate that and he'll turn back to God, and you'll see him give God the glory. But there's also big chunks where it's kind of like he seems to be just following his own ideas and plans, and they're less than appropriate. So the reason that God used Jacob instead of Esau is not because Jacob's a better guy and Esau's a worse guy, but just because it was God's plan. And one of the things that we get to see here is that God's plan works even when people don't stand by it. So in the life of Abraham, we looked at Abraham, and God has a plan with Abraham. Right? Now, Abraham does make some mistakes along the way, but overall, is it fair to say that God had a plan for Abraham and Abraham was trying to fulfill that plan? Right? Even in making the mistakes, they're mistakes in an effort to do what God's plan is. So up to this point, we've had this picture of here's God, he has a plan, and he uses a man who agrees with the plan, and they're working together, and it's happening. Now you get to see something different. God has a plan, and everybody in the family ignores the plan. They all completely just do their own thing. And it still ends up, after all the deceiving and the tricksters and the fighting and the conflict, God's plan still comes to pass. And one of the things that Romans chapter 9 is pointing out in the larger context of Romans 9 is that God knows what he's doing. Right? It isn't that God chose Jacob because he was a better guy than Esau. It was because God had a plan, and God knows what he's doing with that plan. And the best thing that we can do is look at what God says and follow the plan, because if you get in the way of the plan, the only thing that gets run over is you. It will continue, right? I'm reminded of Joshua when they were going to go take Jericho, and the angel of the Lord comes out and he asks him, who are you for, our enemies or for us? Everybody remember the answer that the angel gave? He says, neither. That's right. He says, I'm not for either. I'm for the Lord. And that's an important truth, right? Is that the angel says, well, I'm not for you or for your enemy. I'm for the Lord. And the end result is if you're on the Lord's side, you'll be fine. If you're not on the Lord's side, you're going to get run over. And what we see in Jacob's life is God has a plan. Everybody in the family is going to ignore that plan. And that plan will still happen. And every time they ignore the plan, they get run over. And it's because God knows what he's doing, and he's not going to change just for people. So every family member failed to take seriously God's plan of Genesis 25. So God's plan is they're going to become two nations, these two sons, Jacob and Esau, they're going to become two nations, and the older will serve the younger. So right at the beginning, they're born, Esau is the elder, and Jacob is the younger. So if they're listening to God, from the get-go, they understand the way that this works out is that Esau will serve Jacob, because God said it. But that's not how it works. So let's talk about how each family member ignores that. In the case of Isaac, how does Isaac ignore God's plan in the way that he acts in his family?
To me, Isaac's the big mark against him on this story, because you should know, right? Esau still
Yep.
has the birthright at the beginning, even though he should have known better.
Right.
And after Jacob has the birthright, he tries to bless Esau first. And it's Rebekah who's like, no, you need, Rebekah's the one that orchestrates this whole thing to get the blessing back to Jacob, right? Jacob obeys his mom. But really, Isaac, and it's really symbolized by his physical blindness, is completely spiritually blind, is what he is dogmatic about Esau being the one who inherits the blessings and the promises.
Right. So Isaac has his own plan. And as which I think you said, he had preference, right? He had preference for Esau. That was his favorite. And so he's going to run that system. And I agree. I think as you go through this whole story, Isaac, of anybody, as one, being the son of Abraham and the son of promise himself, and having seen all of these things in his own life, should be the guy saying, hey, whatever God says, we're going to go with that. But he doesn't. He shows preference to Esau and continues to try and treat him as in that role and ignore what they've been told in the beginning. So that's Isaac. How about Rebekah? Was Rebekah just like a perfect mom in all this?
She tried to, she helped try to trick, I think, to believe that Jacob was evil.
Yeah, so Rebekah is the one who sets up and orchestrates the whole, hey, this is how we're going to trick your dad. This is the essence of a good marriage, right? Right? No, there's problems, right? So, and so this whole thing is, there's an unhealthy dynamic in the parents. Then there's this unhealthy dynamic in Jacob and Esau, right? So if you take Esau, what are the things that Esau does wrong? I mean, he didn't show up like a hero in this either. Did you have something?
Yeah, he just despises the promise. He's given the birthright, which represents all the promises of Abraham.
Yep.
Literally.
Yep.
He completely despises it.
Yep. So yeah, and in fact, I think that's the next verse. We'll look at that soon in Hebrews 12, where it specifically deals with Esau. Like Esau is a example to us of somebody who despises the birthright and then makes some really bad choices for short-term gain. Yeah.
This whole story kind of makes me think of the Proverbs, the way to hell is paid with good intentions. I see Isaac, who cares for his son, has a favored one, and he is going to make things work out, and God's going to come around. And the wife is like, well, God says this, and I'm not going to talk to my husband, but I'm going to make things happen for God without dealing with what I should do. And then you got the favored son, the first son, who, when I think despise your birthright, it's the pressure. I mean, he doesn't want it. He doesn't want anything to do with it. And so he sells it for porridge, for soup, and just like casts it away, like Matt was saying, like it doesn't mean nothing. And so it's like this pressure. And then you have the lesser son, or the slightly junior son, that is, I'm going to get ahead by any means possible. And I'm not going to let God take care of it. I'm going to make it happen. So everybody's trying to, in their way, do something, I think, in my mind, they're trying to do something for God, but they're doing it their own way, and they're not letting God do it this way.
They all have a plan, right? They're all in some way working to do what they think is going to work it out. And yeah, in the case of Esau, he despises that birthright, and then ultimately ends up despising his brother over it too, right? Because this entire thing becomes a war between Jacob and Esau. And so then let's look at the last person. So we've looked at Abraham, we looked at Isaac, or not Abraham. We looked at Isaac, we looked at Rebekah, we've looked at Esau. How about Jacob? Is Jacob clean in this process? No. He's the deceiver, right? I mean, he's the one who's saying, okay, I need to supplant, right? I'm going to take this for myself. The reality is let's imagine for a second that everybody, all four of them, just stepped back, and instead of doing the things that they did, they just said, let's just be a happy family that serves God and puts Him first. What would the end result be? Who would serve who in the end? If they just said, we're just going to be a happy family, what would happen?
According to your Ephesians lessons, they'd all serve each other.
They would all serve each other. They'd all be very happy. And then would Jacob and Esau turn into two great nations? Yeah. Why? Because God said it would, right? And would Jacob turn into a stronger nation than Esau? Yes. Why? Because God said so. They didn't have to do any of this stuff. That's the point of it. They didn't have to do any of this. And so what we're looking at is they have all decided in their own way what they want to have happen, and they're going to work it. And you get this family of great conflict and dysfunction, when in reality, all they had to do was step back, right? If Jacob didn't deceive anybody, if Rebekah didn't deceive anybody, if Isaac had just wanted what was best for his boys and didn't try and pick a favorite, all of this would have played out fine. And the interesting thing is, as you progress in the story, there is one guy who does kind of figure that out. And it's Esau, when he's a grown-up. Because when Jacob comes back, and if you remember the account, when Jacob does come back after all the different events have happened, and his brother tried to kill him, he had fled, and he comes back, and he brings all these gifts and sends them ahead of time in hopes that he can placate Esau, because he's thinking, man, he's going to just want to cut my throat. When he gets there, how does Esau treat him? He embraces him. He says, I don't need any of this stuff. The Lord has given me more than what I need, right? So the end result is Esau, at least, comes to the understanding, I would have been fine. I would have been fine. So there's a lot of elements to this particular family, but one of the biggest ones that I think we see is a family of dysfunction that seem to all think they had to be dysfunctional in order to succeed, but that was not the case at all. Anybody have any comments or questions? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about talking about deception necessarily is always evil, because God has used it. This could have been how He planned to orchestrate the promise as well, because especially in regards to women against things that are more powerful. Deception has been a legitimate weapon throughout Scripture for that, even with the Hebrew midwives, when they deceived Pharaoh and his servants, Rahab, all these things that happen. And so we don't want to project our own, we don't want to try to be holier than God. And for sure we are. And so I would think that not necessarily everything Rebekah did here, maybe it was, but it wasn't necessarily so. Because it could have been something that she could have been talking to Isaac, but again, Isaac's blind, which is a pretty powerful symbol in Scripture. You see it with Eli later on with his sons. And so, really, the man here has to take full responsibility for what's going on, and the woman has to do what she can to orchestrate whatever needs to happen. As happens in all these other stories as well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that the bulk of blame falls at Isaac's feet, right? I mean, I think that that's fair to say. I would be pretty cautious about saying deception is okay. I think maybe it's more understandable in their case, but I also get what you're getting at. So, yeah.
Maybe in a similar vein, but maybe a little less uncomfortable. So I think, I'm not sure I disagree with you actually, but just another thought to consider. We tend to view those circumstances as God expressing His omnipotence. He is going to make sure that Jacob will be the one whose favor gets the promise. Could it have been a demonstration of His omniscience In other words, he foresaw this is a messed up, broken family. And yet, from that messed up, broken family, I'm still going to deliver my promises, and it's going to be through the one who comes out of the other end of it.
Oh, and there's no doubt, I think that is true as well, right? Yeah, God knows and is seeing the dysfunctional behavior, and he's still going to use people who are not fundamentally bad people in the sense that they do love the Lord, but there's a lot of problems, and he's going to use that to fulfill his plan. Yes?
Maybe another way to look at some of those morally questionable incidents is to realize that just because God is patient with behavior that is strongly condemned in other places doesn't mean that he approves.
Right.
So, like Romans 2, verse 4, do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? Just because God doesn't strike someone dead or within a certain narrative specifically condemn it, doesn't mean that he's approving what the people in those moments did.
Right.
So, incidents of polygamy or other sorts of things, we wouldn't look at those incidents and be like, oh, well, God's okay with polygamy. Well, we wouldn't do that because we know from other places it's condemned. It's not his standard. It's not what he wanted. And so maybe that helps balance out some of those difficult passages.
And it's important to know in the history books that it's recording what happened, not necessarily how God felt about it.
Right.
And sometimes it'll tell you how God felt about it, but sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. And that is neither condemning nor approving. Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments or questions?
So,
Yes.
I would just say, I think that most of the families that you read about that are even covered in, the Bible reading we did, Hebrews chapter 11, they were messed up.
For sure.
Well, but
Yeah.
we're messed up today.
Yep.
And so, but like what you were saying, it was going to happen one way or another. I mean, I think about David with his brothers, and Samuel was like, this has got to be it. This is the man right here. And God's like, no. Because he knows the heart. So in the same way, it would have worked out one way or the other. I think Theron's right, that God knows that they were going to do this, but at the same time, they didn't have to do this.
Right.
So that goes back into what Jeremy was saying, that God let it happen because he knew it was all going to be taken care of with his son there at the end. So.
Yeah, it's not necessarily approval of individual behavior, but it is God understanding and being able to weave these things together. And that is a Bible truth that we see over and over again, right? Is God taking imperfect people to work his perfect plan, which we should find a great deal of confidence in. You go and look at Romans 8:28, which is a favored passage of so many, and for good reason, that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love the Lord, who are called according to his purpose. What that's saying is, I can take people whose circumstances and lives are not perfect and weave them together to do what I wish. So, yeah.
But I think the point you were making is, if we were more familiar with God and who he is, and more sensitive to what his desires are, it goes so much better for us if we were to align ourselves with his plan.
It could be a smoother road.
Instead of fighting against it the whole way like some of these people did.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. It could be a smoother road, but God takes people on bumpy roads. Then they've done that, probably going to do it again. So, yes. Along those lines, too, and this was, we kind of touched on just a little bit, Hebrews points out that as you look into Esau and selling of his birthright, and that account's found in Genesis chapter 25, down in verse 27 is about where it starts. Esau will come in from the field, and he's hungry, and Jacob says, I'll give you this stew if you sell me your birthright. And in a decision that is not well thought out, spur of the moment, based off of his earthly, physical desires of hunger at the moment, he goes, sure. And Hebrews uses that particular moment as a teaching moment in time for all mankind. That what he did is something all of us need to be very, very careful not to do, and we're all prone to the temptation of, which is to sell something of eternal value for something of temporary value. And if you continue in Hebrews 12 there, where he talks about it, not only does it refer to Esau as an immoral or godless person, meaning he did something that was immoral when he did that. It was wrong for him to sell that and to view it that way. Godless, meaning he's not factoring in the value of something that God gives the firstborn. And then further down, which I don't have on the screen, it says that later on when he sought it with tears, there was no room for repentance. One of the major aspects of Esau is once he did it, there was no undoing it. You could not unring that bell or unfire that shot. And one of the great temptations of life for all human beings is to make decisions based off of here and now. And then, of course, you get to the judgment day, and everybody wants to change their decision then. Right? There's not going to be any disagreement over what was worth spending your time and effort on when you get to the judgment day. Lost and saved alike will say, wait a second, the best thing you could have spent your life on was following Christ. But there will no more be room for repentance at that point. And it's, here in Hebrews 12, it discusses Esau saying he sought it with tears. It's interesting when you think about the descriptions that are given to us of hell. It's a place of two things, two emotions that are described. There's a gnashing of teeth, and what's the other one? Weeping. Right? He sought it with tears, but he couldn't find it. I think that's one of the allusions that the Bible gives us to the emotional state of those who spend eternity away from God. Right? Is that they will know they made the wrong decision and it's too late to change it. That weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments there?
Why we have to be careful, how, some people say, well, I'll just do that and he's sorry and repent of it later. You don't know that you're going to get another chance to, you could die, but also your heart can turn, and you don't know that your heart is going to be able to, turn that. That's kind of a sobering thought.
It is, yeah, and you're right, because you can't factor in one, like you said, you can't factor in time, right? You make a decision that is wicked, and you say, well, I'll change later. Well, one, you don't know if there will be a later, and two, we're shown over and over again that sin has an impact not just externally but internally, right? Because sin has a way of changing you, and so you don't know. The person who right now is on the edge, you sin, there's a hardening of heart that happens, and you might not be on the edge next time. It's much harder to pull it back, and that's something that we see in life all the time. Yeah.
I think to add to that, why this is so hard is because we don't walk around with an eternal perspective on our minds all the time, right? We're like Esau, we're hungry, I want something to eat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bored, what am I going to spend my time doing? It's Saturday, what am I going to do? We have a very proximate, narrow-minded view of how a decision to make. But on the other hand, if we were to somehow constantly remind ourselves of that eternal perspective and the long reach of the decision that seems so trivial, then I think we'd make better decisions.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's, one of the things that we wonder sometimes, it's like, why has God set up the church the way he has? I think one aspect of it is what you just hit on is, us worshiping it's not just that it brings God joy, although I do feel very much so that it does. When we worship, when we study, when we spend time together, it helps us kind of lengthen that perspective a little bit, right? It's just go, okay, right. When we're singing songs about heaven, it reminds us, right, let's kind of move my view out to the larger thing, because you're constantly being skewed down to the finite view of things. Certainly is the case for me. So, any other thoughts? Okay, so some other things to consider here as we look at the life of Jacob. You move forward and you get to what is sometimes referred to as Jacob's ladder, or his dream. We move to chapter 28. And in Genesis chapter 28, you have Jacob, and he has now fled. He's left, as he left, he is fearing his life, fearing that Esau will kill him. Now that his father is gone, and as he leaves, in verse 10 of chapter 28, he departed from Beersheba and went down toward Haran, and he came to a certain place, and he spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place, and he put it under his head, and he lay down in that place, and he had a dream. And behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob has this dream, and there are several interesting aspects to this particular dream. One, it's a funny dream. It's just a strange. Funny not in ha-ha, funny like strange. It's not something that we get a whole lot of context to in the Bible. You just have Jacob. He's off, leaving, and he has this dream one night in the middle of the journey, and all we really see is the aspect of the dream, and then there's a promise that in the same way that he's seeing these angels ascending and descending up and down this ladder, God's going to take care of him. And wherever he goes, it'll work out. So one, it's just a strange dream in that it kind of stands alone without a ton of context. Another aspect to this particular dream that has been noted by multiple commentators, and I tend to agree, is it's the opposite of Babel. It's the opposite of Babel. If you look at Babel, they're on the ground and they're trying to build something up to heaven, right? And they're trying to say, look at how great we are to get up there. And how well does that work? Not at all. This is the opposite. God's saying, I'm going to start up here, and I'm going to send angels back and forth, and when I do that, it works. So instead of man's plan, it's God's plan. And at the time that Jacob receives this plan, he has essentially nothing. Right? He's fleeing for his life. Everything is imploded. This whole idea of him being the impressive leader, the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that we kind of know him as, the Jacob who would be known as Israel, that the whole nation is named after, doesn't really exist. He's a guy with a stone for a pillow. And yet God says, I have my eyes on you, and I'm going to take care of you, and it will all go well. And of course it does. God does all of those things. He does become a great and mighty nation. God does bless that nation. They do spread out like the dust of the earth, and he repeats the promise to Abraham that he had made, that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him, which is a reference to what? That's a reference to Jesus, right? So we have a direct connection to the Abrahamic promise is continuing from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and their descendants. Now, turn over in your Bible to John 1. So in John chapter 1, Jesus is having this conversation with Nathanael, who was skeptical at first, especially of Jesus being the Messiah, even though his friends had come and told him so. And we get start up probably in verse 47. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and he said, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. And Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. Excuse me, I missed a couple of verses there. Verse 48, Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? Jesus answered, he said to him, before Philip called you when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. So that awareness that Jesus had of what Nathanael was doing was enough to tip the balance for him. We're never given a whole lot of detail about what was going under that fig tree, but it was enough that when Jesus makes reference to it, Nathanael goes, you really are the guy that everybody else is telling me. But then in verse 50, Jesus answered and he said to him, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That is a very strong correlation to what we just read in Genesis. Jesus says, you know what you're going to see? You're going to see the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. You're going to see what Jacob was told about in his dream. God is going to send his angel to take care of this thing. And when you look at Jesus' life, did Nathanael ever likely, unless there's something not included in the text, it is likely that Nathanael never actually saw an angel ascending or descending on Jesus, right? We're not talking about physical. But what he did see is Jesus, the guy who Nathanael had just said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Right? He's a nobody. How could he be the guy? Instead, all of that, he will see all of those things work together so that Jesus is the Son of God. It is clear to Nathanael, and God has been working this majestic plan all along. It's very similar to what you saw with Jacob. Jacob, he's a nothing at the time, but God says, no, you're a something. And how much more so is that the case with Jesus? So, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions or thoughts on that? Okay, so as was mentioned earlier, one of the things that stands out about Jacob is this event found in chapter 32. So in chapter 32, Jacob, on his return from his exile, I guess you could say, he's coming back now with a family, and he's going to meet Esau. Very fearful of what Esau might say or do, but he sends all of his family away ahead of him. And then in verse 24, he's the only one left. And it says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh, so the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. And then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you asked my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I've seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. This is an odd event. Jacob's life is full of just these odd little events. And here, he wrestles with, and it says he's wrestling with a man, but by the time you're done with the end of the story, you understand it's not a man, it's an angel. Right? An angel in human form. And the only thing that you really know in all of this about Jacob is Jacob just won't let go. I mean, that's the only kind of detail about this story that seems to stand out, is that, man, he touches his hip, it comes out of the socket, and he will limp from that day forward. So this is a permanent injury that's done to him that will have an impact. And Jacob just won't let go, and the angel says, well, it's getting to daybreak. Let go. And he says, I won't. And so the blessing that he receives is for just, his name's going to be changed. His name means that he's a striver. He's a fighter. He's striven with God and with men. The name literally means he who strives with God. And you can see times in Jacob's life where that's a very negative thing. Right? There are some times in Jacob's life where you could say, oh, he strove with God or fought with God or wrestled with God, and you go, well, that was not a good decision, Jacob. Right? That wasn't going very well. But what you do find with Jacob is that he doesn't let go. And God ends up turning that into a blessing. And I think if you look at the life of Jacob, that's one of the major themes over and over and over again is here's a guy, made a lot of mistakes, a lot of things broken, a lot of problems along the way, but somehow God turns it into a blessing because the guy doesn't let go. But another aspect, as you look at this, is that became the name not just of him, right? His name goes from Jacob to Israel, strives with God. And sometimes when you think about Jacob striving with God, you think good things, sometimes you think bad things. But it didn't just become his name, it became the name of the nation that would follow. And when you think of the nation of Israel, and you ask the question, did the nation of Israel strive with God? Yup. In bad ways? Yup. In good ways? Yup. It's both. It becomes their kind of defining characteristic. And some members of the nation did really bad, and others did really well. You see Jacob embodying what would be the characteristic of the rest of the nation. I have up there a wrestling mat, because whenever I think about Jacob, I think the one thing you can say about Jacob is he always got in the ring. He always just kept getting back in the ring. He got back in the circle. And so God used him. And ultimately, Jacob goes from being a guy who's this one type to being seen as that being turned into a positive attribute. Anybody have any thoughts or questions or anything like that before we move on? Okay, we just got one last thing we'll look at before we shut down entirely, and that is in John chapter 4, when Jesus is in Samaria, there's reference to Jacob's well, of which I don't have a picture of the well. You've got pictures of the well. I know you do. But it was a famous well at that time and still is. So it's a well-known location, and it's attributed to Jacob. Interestingly enough, there's not somewhere specific in the account of the Bible that tells you exactly where it is. There's some guesses people have. But Jesus meets the Samaritan woman there, and she asks a question. You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle? And we get this picture that's given to us in the New Testament of Jacob was a great guy. In the end, history accounted him as a very great guy. But him in comparison to Jesus, think of how many differences, right? Jacob came with deception. Jesus came with truth. Jacob limped after wrestling. And then on the other hand, you have Jesus who gave up his whole life. So, just another thing to think about, and something you might spend a little bit of your own time on, is looking at the contrasts and comparisons between Jacob and Jesus in terms of character and the things they did with their life. Otherwise, we will shut down there, and we will pick up next week.